Year 8, this is Mrs. Holly. I hope you're all well. So far this lesson, if you've been following the task sheet, you'll have been reviewing your ideas from reading Chapter 7 of Animal Farm, finding examples of how Napoleon is presented as a dictator, and then writing up your ideas in a paragraph. For the final part of the lesson, we're going to look at the use of propaganda and manipulation in Animal Farm, and how this connects to the real-life events of the Russian Revolution. First of all, let's clarify what we mean by propaganda. Propaganda is any sort of communication that's used to influence people's opinion, usually by giving only one side of an argument. Closely related to this is the idea of manipulation, which is where we try and change our opinions or perceptions using deception or underhanded techniques. An example of manipulation might be if you try to tell me that you didn't do your homework because you didn't know you had it, but you leave out the information that the only reason you didn't know you had it was because you haven't checked Show My Homework for ages and that you weren't really listening when I set the homework in class. That's you trying to change my perception of what's going on using a somewhat underhanded technique, in that case by leaving out key information. Let's have a look at a couple of modern examples of propaganda, which almost inevitably are going to be linked to one of the major political crises of our times, that of Brexit. So, this is an example of propaganda, and this was produced just before the Leave vote a few years ago by the people who wanted Britain to leave the European Union. We send the EU £350 million a week. Let's fund our NHS instead. Vote Leave. So, propaganda, remember, is any communication that's used to influence people's opinions. And in this case, this poster on the side of a bus is trying to influence us to vote to leave the EU. But again, because it's propaganda, it's really only giving one side of the argument. Because while it's true that we do send the EU an awful lot of money every week, the fact that we might stop sending the EU money doesn't necessarily mean that we would have any money left over. And it also doesn't mean that that money would actually go to fund our National Health Service. On the other side of the coin, propaganda was produced by the people who wanted to remain in the EU. This poster was put up again just before the Leave vote. Look, can you stop making such a fuss? Some of us stand to make an absolute fortune out of this. Prepare for Brexit at gov.uk. Brexit. Now, this piece of propaganda is giving a completely different side of the story. What this piece of propaganda is suggesting is that actually the government want the UK to leave the EU for their own reasons, because actually some corrupt individuals are going to make a lot of money out of the fact that our economy would be separate to Europe, and that it's not actually in the national interests. So this piece of propaganda is giving another one-dimensional look at a complicated issue, and could also perhaps be criticised for being somewhat one-sided. For instance, the fact that some people might make money out of Brexit doesn't mean that it's not in the overall national interests. So, having had a look at propaganda, let's move on. We need to come back all the time when we're reading Animal Farm and remember that Orwell is writing a book about a group of farmyard animals who are taking power on a farm. However, we also need to remember that the book is an allegory or a representation of real-life events. Orwell is therefore putting examples of propaganda and manipulation into Animal Farm in order to draw attention to real-life examples of propaganda that were actually taking place in Russia. What we're going to do now is to have a look at examples of real-life Russian propaganda from the 1930s. Have a look at this poster. Write down 3 to 5 things that this poster is telling you about life in Russia in the 1930s. This was produced by the Russian government. Have a look at all of the details. Maybe think about the color, the mood of the overall piece. What is the person who produced this poster trying to tell you that life in Russia was like? Pause the video for a second to give yourself time to think and write. Now we're going to have a look at the other side of the coin. This is an American newspaper front page, which was published at around about the same time as the Russian poster you've just looked at. So, in exactly the same way, I want you to write down 3 to 5 things that this American newspaper is telling you about what life in life was like in Russia in the 1930s. Pause the video to give yourself time to do this. Your third question is this. Why do you think that the Russian government and the American newspaper are presenting life in Russia in such different ways? Have another look at those 2 images below and try to have a think. Why might these be giving such completely different views? Pause the video to give yourself some time to think. So, Russia's reasons for producing that propaganda poster. There are a few that you could have had. Perhaps Russia produced this poster that presents Russian life as so prosperous because they didn't want people to know how hard life in Russia really was at the time. Perhaps they didn't want anyone to start criticizing the government and saying that perhaps they weren't running Russia in a particularly good way. Maybe they wanted to avoid protests or perhaps another form of revolution. And perhaps they wanted to pretend to the people outside Russia that everything was okay. On the other hand, perhaps the American newspaper has got an agenda of its own. Maybe they stood to gain by saying that Russian life was actually much worse than was being presented. Maybe they just wanted to entertain their newspaper readers and make themselves feel better, that American life was so much better than Russian life. The point is that the people who presented both of these texts had their own motivations. They weren't either necessarily trying to give a completely true or accurate picture of what life in Russia was really like. And so now we need to be able to link this back to what happened in Animal Farm by the end of chapter 7. What was happening in the book, what's happened so far, to indicate that the leaders of Animal Farm are using propaganda and manipulation to make the animals think more positively about the farm and their leaders. Pause the video to give yourself time to write down your answer. So here are a few answers that you could have had, and there are quite a few examples that you could have picked. You could have talked about how, in chapter 7, Napoleon seems to try to frighten Boxer indirectly with a show of power. When the dogs attack Boxer, perhaps what Napoleon is doing is to try and get Boxer back for the fact that Boxer disagreed with him publicly. He doesn't want to do that directly by attacking Boxer, he just wants to rattle his nerves. That would be manipulating Boxer's emotions. It would be perhaps a show of power on the part of Napoleon. You could also have chosen examples of any of Squealer's behaviour. So when Squealer says that life used to be worse on the farm, even if it is a bit difficult now, or when Squealer justifies that the pigs should have more food because they are the thinkers. Squealer is essentially spreading propaganda. He's giving a one-sided part to the story. The real reason that the pigs want the milk and the extra rations is because they're greedy, because they just want the good things for themselves. But Squealer's trying to justify it by saying that the pigs are the thinkers on the farm and therefore need more calories, they need more nourishment. Finally, we're going to have a look at another sort of manipulation that's going on in Animal Farm, and how this links the character Napoleon with the real-life leader Stalin. So, if we are saying that George Orwell's book, Animal Farm, is an allegory for the Russian Revolution, then we can connect some specific characters to specific real-life historical figures. In this book, the leader of the farm, Napoleon, is an allegory or a representation of the real-life Russian leader, Joseph Stalin. He was a dictator. That meant that he held complete power and control for most of the time that he ruled Russia between 1926 and 1953. Stalin wasn't the leader from the start of the revolution. That was Vladimir Lenin, who we've discussed before. However, after Lenin died, Stalin ended up in a fight for power with another real-life figure, Leon Trotsky. Stalin eventually won. He gained control, and Trotsky, his rival, had to flee into exile in Mexico and was later assassinated, probably on Stalin's orders. So, in the power struggle between Stalin and Trotsky, Stalin definitely won. Trotsky was forced out, couldn't live in Russia anymore, and eventually died. After this, Stalin took more and more power for himself, creating the position of a dictator, absolute power over the country. He used, during this time, lots of different types of media, like posters, newspapers, radio broadcasts, and even altering people's photographs to change people's ideas about history and to manipulate what they thought about the Russian regime. We're going to have a look at a few examples of that. What is the difference between these photos? The one on the left is the original, and the one on the right is a later copy which has been changed. Pause the video for a second to write down what the difference is. Here's another example. Again, pause the video to write down what the difference is between the original photo on the left and the amended photo on the right. And here's your third example. Again, what's the difference between the photo on the left and the photo on the right? What do you think Stalin was trying to do by changing these photographs in this way? And why would he want to do this? Pause the video for a second to write down what you think Stalin has been doing here and why you think he would want to do this. So, have a look at your answers. There are a few different suggestions here. Stalin seems to be trying, by amending these photos, to erase his old rival Leon Trotsky from history, to the point of pretending that he didn't exist. By taking an important photo of Lenin, a revered and important original ruler of Russia, and taking Trotsky out of the photo, Stalin's then spreading the idea that Trotsky was never in a position of power and was never able to be Stalin's rival. He's trying to change history after the fact. The reason that Stalin would want to do this is because it maybe made it seem like he was the only potential leader to take over after Lenin died, and perhaps to make people forget about the fact that there was someone powerful who really seriously disagreed with Stalin and what he represented. So now we have to think about the connections that we can make to Animal Farm. What is the connection between Stalin editing photos, like these pictures, and Squealer's story about Snowball and Animal Farm? You might need to review what happened in Chapter 7 to get the detail here, but pause the video and give yourself time to think and to write. So let's have a think about your answers. It's important to remember that Squealer doesn't try to pretend that Snowball didn't exist in the way that those edited photos seem to suggest. But Squealer is definitely trying to manipulate people's memories in the same way that Stalin does when he amends these photos. Squealer is trying to spread the story that actually the brave hero Snowball from the Battle of the Cowshed wasn't brave at all, and actually gives all the credit for those brave events to Napoleon. He's trying to change people's minds about what Snowball was like. And Snowball, remember, isn't on Animal Farm at the moment to defend himself. Squealer in this book represents the propaganda machine on Animal Farm. He's manipulating the memories of the animals in whatever way works best for Napoleon. What Orwell seems to be saying is that communication and language equals power. Squealer's ability to get the animals to doubt their own memories, to doubt what they've seen with their own eyes, shows how important it is for the people who have power over our media to tell the truth. Thank you very much. Your next lesson will be coming up in a day or so.